I told you to get out. You hear me? Get out of my house!
He trusted his wife until he saw what she did to his disabled mother. He walked in just in time to hear his mother scream. Not a stranger, not a thief, but his own wife, standing over his disabled mother, rage in her eyes. The woman who couldn't walk on her own. The woman who trusted her daughter-in-law with her life. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. She didn't know someone was watching from the hallway. She didn't know the truth was about to surface. He thought he married a caring, patient woman. Someone who understood sacrifice. Someone who respected the woman who gave him life. But what he saw shattered everything. Now he's not just a husband. He's a son facing an impossible choice. Protect the woman who raised him, or protect the marriage built on a lie. Because after tonight, nothing in this family will ever be the same. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ocean of Tales. Kindly like, comment, and subscribe on this channel. We will be grateful if you help us do this. We will be notifying you when we drop a new video. Don't forget to tell us where you are watching from. The front door creaked open with a tired groan, the kind of sound a house makes when it thinks it's alone. His shoes touched the tiled floor, still cold from the evening rain, and for one quiet second the house felt ordinary. Too ordinary. Then the scream ripped through the walls.
Sharp, broken, human.
It wasn't loud like a shout. It was worse. It was the sound of someone who had already given up hope of being heard. His chest locked instantly, breath caught halfway in, keys slipping from his fingers to the floor with a soft clatter that felt painfully loud. He didn't move yet. His body knew before his mind accepted it. That scream didn't come from outside. It came from inside the house. From deep within the place he trusted most. And before he could stop himself, a single terrifying thought settled in his head. What kind of pain makes a mother scream like that? The air felt thicker as he stepped forward, like the house itself was resisting him. Another sound followed. Not a scream this time, but a sharp impact, the dull thud of something hitting flesh or bone or wood. His heartbeat climbed into his throat, loud enough to drown out everything else. The hallway lights flickered as if unsure whether to stay on. Family photos lined the walls, smiling faces, celebrations, weddings, memories frozen in time. Every frame suddenly felt like a lie. He told himself it had to be an accident. Maybe the wheelchair tipped. Maybe she slipped while helping. Maybe anything else. But his feet kept moving, faster now, guided by fear instead of reason. The smell of antiseptic and old furniture mixed with something sour in the air, something wrong. And with every step, the question grew heavier. Why did that scream sound like betrayal? His hand brushed the wall as he turned the corner, steadying himself as another muffled cry echoed through the house. This one was weaker.
Strained.
Like it came from a body that had already taken too much. The temperature dropped suddenly, goosebumps rising on his arms despite the closed windows. His mind raced backward through memories, his mother laughing softly, thanking his wife for small kindnesses, insisting she was not a burden. He remembered believing it, wanting to believe it. Trust is easy when you don't look too closely. His stomach twisted as a shadow moved at the end of the hallway, sharp and jerky, not gentle like care should be. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage where something unforgivable was unfolding. And he was just arriving for the final act. The sound stopped suddenly.
No scream. No cry.
Just silence. Thick, heavy silence that pressed against his ears harder than noise ever could. Silence that meant someone was waiting. Or hiding. Or standing over someone who couldn't move. His pulse hammered as he slowed, every instinct screaming at him to stop, to turn back, to pretend he never heard anything at all. The hallway carpet felt rough under his feet, each step deliberate now, controlled, terrified. A faint scraping sound followed, metal against tile. A wheelchair. His mother's wheelchair. His jaw tightened, so hard it hurt. He had promised himself this house was safe for her. Promised she would never suffer again. And yet the silence ahead felt like a broken promise breathing in the dark. Light spilled from the living room, sharp and bright, cutting across the hallway like a blade. He paused just before stepping into it, his shadows stretching long behind him. His reflection flickered briefly in a glass cabinet. Wide eyes, pale face, a man on the edge of something irreversible. From where he stood, he could hear breathing now. Not his mother's.
Too calm.
Too steady. Someone else was there. Someone who felt in control. His fingers curled into fists as anger began to rise, slow and dangerous, burning away confusion. Whatever was happening in that room wasn't an accident. Accidents don't sound deliberate. And for the first time since he entered the house, fear gave way to something colder. He leaned slightly forward, careful not to make a sound, peering into the room from the edge of the wall. The sight froze him mid-breath. His mother was slumped in her wheelchair, hands trembling, eyes wide with pain and disbelief. And standing over her, blocking the light, casting a long shadow across her fragile body, was his wife. Not panicked, not helping, but rigid, tense. Her face twisted in an expression he had never seen before, raw and unfiltered, stripped of every polite smile she wore outside these walls. Rage lived there.
Contempt.
Something ugly and old. In that moment, the scream replayed in his mind, clearer now, sharper. It wasn't just pain. It was fear of someone she trusted. And suddenly, the truth felt too big to fit inside his chest. The room seemed to tilt as understanding crashed down on him, heavy and brutal. This wasn't a moment. It was a pattern. Not a mistake, but a habit. The woman he married, the woman he defended, the woman he trusted with his mother's life, was someone else entirely when no one was watching. His pulse thundered in his ears as his wife shifted her weight, unaware she was no longer alone. He realized then that everything he believed about his home was wrong. And as he took one slow step forward into the light, a terrifying question formed in his mind. How long had this been happening right under his nose? Cold air brushed Mama Ifeoma's bare ankles as the wheelchair creaked in place. The small front wheels turned slightly inward like they were trying to hide. Her fingers shook over the armrest, knuckles pale against dark skin, as if her body was fighting not to fall apart in front of witnesses. The room smelled like menthol balm and old fabric, comfort scents that used to mean safe, now mixed with a sharp sting of fierce sweat. A faint tear line cut down her cheek and disappeared into the wrapper at her chest. She didn't cry loudly. She never did. She had learned long ago that loud tears make people tired of you. She only stared at the floor, eyes wide and wet, as if the tiles could explain why kindness had turned into cruelty. Behind her, the curtains moved slightly from the ceiling fan, soft and steady, like the house itself didn't care who was breaking inside it. And when her lips parted to speak, only a strained whisper came out, too weak to be a complaint, too heavy to be nothing. So what had she been forced to swallow for months? A sharp memory slammed into Chinita's chest as he stepped closer, because Mama Ifeoma had not always been this small. He remembered hands that once carried gallons of water without shaking, hands that cooked for 6 people with the speed of a restaurant, hands that braided hair, patched uniforms, and still had energy to pray at midnight. He remembered her walking fast through dusty streets in Enugu, wrapper tied tight, face set like a woman who didn't wait for life to be fair. Then the accident happened, one bad road, one loud crash, one moment of metal and silence, and everything from her waist down became a locked door. People moved on quickly after the sympathy faded. She didn't. She stayed, learning how to live sitting down, learning how to smile while asking for help, learning how to pretend she wasn't embarrassed each time someone lifted her like luggage. And now, seeing her tremble in that chair, Chinita's mind couldn't stop asking a simple, violent question. Who turned his mother into a quiet target? A soft rattling sound came from the tray beside the wheelchair as Mama Ifeoma's medicine bottle rolled slightly, tapping against a cup. The label looked worn, the way worn labels scream routine, like the same pain has been showing up daily, and nobody stopped it. She tried to straighten her back, but her body refused, shoulders drooping as if even dignity was heavy tonight. Chinito noticed the little details he used to ignore. The faint bruise at her wrist, the dry crack at the corner of her lip, the way her wrapper was tied in a hurried knot, not her usual neat style. His stomach turned because these weren't new injuries. They were old evidence. And behind that evidence sat a deeper truth. His mother had been managing suffering alone, choosing silence over drama, because she didn't want to spoil his marriage. She had protected his peace with her own pain. When she finally lifted her eyes to his, they carried a question that begged and warned at the same time. Will you believe me, or will you leave me to it again? The floorboard creaked under Amara's heel as she shifted her stance, and Mama Ifeoma flinched, like her body recognized danger before her mind could argue. That flinch hit Chinito harder than any scream. It was a reflex built through repetition, proof that fear had been living here. Mama Ifeoma's mouth moved again, and this time a few words slipped out, thin but clear, like a secret finally refusing to stay buried. Baiko, I didn't do anything. The sentence didn't sound like a defense. It sounded like a habit. Chinito's throat tightened as his eyes scanned the room again. The overturned footrest, the spilled water near the chair, the rag on the floor that looked like it had been used too roughly. The scene didn't look like caregiving. It looked like control. And the worst part? Mama Ifeoma wasn't looking at Amara with anger. She was looking at her with pleading, like a woman still trying to keep peace with someone who had no peace inside. So, what exactly had Amara been doing when nobody was home? A distant generator hummed outside, steady like Lagos never sleeps, while inside the living room everything felt paused at the edge of violence. Chinito's eyes caught the framed wedding photo on the wall. Amara smiling in white lace, Mama Ifeoma behind them, hands placed gently on their shoulders like a blessing. That photo now felt like a trap. He remembered how Mama Ifeoma had welcomed Amara, how she called her my daughter, and defended her even when aunties gossiped. He remembered sending money for his mother's care and trusting that love would fill the gaps his absence created. But trust is a dangerous thing when it's handed to someone who knows how to perform. He looked at his mother again, noticing how she sat slightly angled away from Amara, like her body had learned to create distance even in a small room. Then he noticed the tiny tear in the side of her blouse, fresh, jagged, not from age. His chest burned as one thought took over everything. If this is what he sees once, what has he missed 100 times? A soft scraping noise rose again as Mama Ifeoma tried to adjust herself, and pain flashed across her face so quickly she couldn't hide it. Chinito's hands twitched like he wanted to rush forward, but his body hesitated, because stepping in meant ending a version of life he had been living comfortably. Amara's voice suddenly cut through the tension, short and sharp, trying to control the story before it became truth. It's not what you think. The words sounded rehearsed, like they had been waiting in her mouth for the day she got caught. Mama Ifeoma's eyes widened, not in surprise, but in tired recognition. As if she had heard that exact sentence before, after every act of cruelty. Chinito felt something shift inside him, something heavy sliding into place. His mother wasn't just injured. She was being managed, silenced, conditioned. And in that moment, he realized the wheelchair wasn't the only thing trapping her in this house. So, what else had Amara taken from her besides movement? A gust of warm air swept in as the front door failed to latch fully, and the sound of it clicking loose felt like a warning bell. Chinito stared at Mama Ifeoma's hands again, hands that once fed him, fought for him, prayed for him, and saw how they gripped the chair like it was the only stable thing left in her world. He stepped closer until he could smell the shea butter on her skin, the faint scent that always reminded him of childhood, and suddenly his anger tasted like metal in his mouth. Mama Ifeoma swallowed hard, eyes shining, and whispered another sentence, almost too quiet to catch. I didn't want to scatter your home. Those words landed like a slap, because they revealed the deepest tragedy. She had been enduring hell just to protect his happiness. Chinito's gaze lifted slowly toward Amara, and his wife's face tightened like a door being locked from the inside. He wasn't looking at two women anymore. He was looking at a battle line drawn across his life. And the question that rose like smoke was terrifyingly simple. When he finally chooses a side, what will Amara do next? Morning light once poured into this same living room with an easy softness, catching on polished tiles and bouncing off framed memories like nothing dark could survive here. Amara used to move through the house calmly then, her footsteps light, her voice gentle, her smiles perfectly timed. She knew when to laugh, when to lower her eyes, when to touch Mama Ifeoma's shoulder just long enough for anyone watching to feel reassured. Chinedu had watched those moments from a distance and felt relief settle in his chest. This was the life he wanted, orderly, respectful, smooth. He mistook calm for kindness. Now, standing in that same room, the light felt harsher, almost accusatory, exposing corners he had never bothered to look into. The silence between them wasn't peaceful anymore. It was loaded, tense like a wire pulled too tight. And suddenly, he wondered how many times he had walked past warning signs disguised as good behavior. There had been so many moments that made sense only now. Amara's constant reminders about how difficult caregiving was. Her sighs when Mama Ifeoma rang the bell too often. Her subtle complaints wrapped in concern, delivered gently so Chinedu never felt alarmed. She never shouted, never cursed. She weaponized calm. She mastered the art of sounding reasonable while slowly shifting responsibility away from herself. Chinedu had nodded along, distracted by work, deadlines, pressure. He trusted her because trust was easier than questioning the woman he loved. And in that trust, he handed her power. Over his home, over his mother, over the truth. The silence that followed each conversation wasn't peace. It was permission. And now that permission stood in front of him, breathing steadily, daring him to challenge it. Family gatherings replayed in his mind like old footage suddenly remastered in brutal clarity. Amara laughing with aunties, serving food carefully, praising Mama Ifeoma publicly for being strong. Mama Ifeoma always smiled at those words, even when her eyes looked tired. Chinedu remembered thinking that strength meant endurance. He didn't understand then that endurance can become a prison when nobody notices the cost. Amara thrived in those moments. Admiration fed her. Approval polished her image. She learned quickly that cruelty didn't need noise. It needed timing. It needed witnesses absent and excuses ready. Looking at her now, Chinedu realized she had been performing a role, not living a truth. And the scariest part wasn't how well she played it. It was how easily everyone, including him, applauded. The house itself had been rearranged quietly over time. Furniture shifted. Doors kept closed. Mama Ifeoma's space grew smaller, tucked away from common areas, while Amara's presence expanded everywhere else. Chinedu never questioned it. He thought it was convenience. He thought it was organization. But power always reshapes space before it reveals itself. Amara's calm voice now echoed in his head, explaining rules he never remembered agreeing to. What time Mama Ifeoma could sit outside. How often she should ask for help. Which days were too stressful. All delivered softly. All accepted without argument. Standing there now, Chinedu felt the weight of every silent yes he had given without realizing it. And the room felt suddenly too small for the truth pressing in. Amara straightened her blouse slowly, as if reclaiming control through appearance alone. Her face shifted back into the version Chinedu recognized, the composed wife, the reasonable partner. She spoke calmly, explaining, minimizing, shaping reality with careful words. She framed the moment as stress, as misunderstanding, as exaggeration. Her tone carried confidence built from years of never being challenged. Mama Ifeoma shrank slightly at the sound, shoulders curling inward, already preparing herself to disappear. Chinedu noticed that reaction instantly, and this time, he didn't explain it away. He saw how silence had trained his mother to expect dismissal. He saw how his wife relied on that expectation. And suddenly, the marriage he thought was built on trust looked more like something balanced on fear and convenience. A distant laugh drifted in from outside. Neighbors passing, unaware, untouched by the tension cracking open inside the house. Chinidu felt anger rise, not hot and explosive, but cold and precise. He replayed moments when Mama Ifeoma tried to speak, only to be interrupted. Moments when Amara answered questions meant for his mother. Moments when he chose not to notice because life was easier that way. Love, he realized, doesn't just fail loudly. Sometimes it fails quietly, one ignored detail at a time. He wasn't just confronting Amara anymore. He was confronting himself. And that realization hurt more than betrayal ever could. The silence stretched again, thicker than before, no longer protective but threatening. Amara's eyes flicked briefly toward the hallway, calculating, searching for an escape or an angle. Mama Ifeoma stared at the floor, bracing for disappointment she had already rehearsed. Chinita stood between them, feeling the weight of years settle onto his shoulders all at once. The marriage he trusted had been built on carefully managed silence, and silence had always favored the one with power. Now that silence was breaking, cracking open under the pressure of truth. And as Chinidu drew a slow breath, one question rose sharply above all others. If this was only the surface, what waited underneath once the silence was completely gone? A dull thud echoed in Chinida's memory as his mind rewound itself, replaying scenes he had once dismissed as nothing. The house had always been quiet during the day, too quiet. While he was away at work, doors stayed shut, curtains drawn, sounds contained. It felt peaceful back then. Now he understood it was controlled. The living room lights hummed softly above them, but his thoughts drifted into darker hours when the house belonged only to two women and one imbalance of power. The cruelty didn't arrive as violence at first. It arrived as tone, as impatience, as long pauses meant to remind Mama Ifeoma, who decided when help came. And the realization hit him hard. Abuse doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers until silence becomes survival. Every closed door in the house now felt like a witness. The bedroom door where Mama Ifeoma was left alone too long. The bathroom door she couldn't open without assistance. The kitchen door that blocked the sound of her calls for help. Chinidu imagined her sitting there, listening to footsteps move past her without stopping, hearing television laughter drown out her discomfort. Neglect wears the mask of busyness. Control hides behind routine. Amara never needed to raise her voice. She simply delayed care, withheld comfort, measured help like a privilege instead of a responsibility. And with each small act, she trained Mama Ifeoma to expect nothing. That kind of cruelty leaves no bruises, but it rewrites a person's spirit. And Chinidu wondered how long his mother had been shrinking to fit someone else's convenience. The smell of cleaning chemicals suddenly made sense. The over-sanitized house, spotless surfaces hiding rot underneath. Amara kept the home pristine, almost obsessive, as if order could erase guilt. But Mama Ifeoma's space was different.
Sparse.
Cold. Functional.
No items. No souvenirs.
Just survival. Chinidu pictured his mother staring at the clock, counting hours until he returned, rehearsing smiles so she wouldn't worry him. The cruelty wasn't dramatic. It was repetitive, quiet, relentless. And the most dangerous part was how ordinary it looked from the outside. Anyone visiting would see a tidy home and a polite wife. No one would see a woman slowly being erased. That invisibility was the real weapon. A faint clink of metal against tile snapped Chinidu back into the room. The wheelchair shifting slightly again. Mama Ifeoma's breath hitched, instinctively bracing for reprimand. That reaction confirmed everything. Fear had rules here. Fear had routines. Amara's posture remained firm, arms crossed now, jaw tight, eyes cold. She didn't look surprised to be seen. She looked annoyed, like a system interrupted. And Chinidu realized then that this cruelty wasn't emotional overflow, it was intentional, structured,
Practiced.
the kind that thrives only when no one interferes. And the thought that chilled him most was simple and devastating. This would have continued forever if he hadn't come home early. A memory surfaced uninvited. Amara once saying, casually, that Mama Ifioma was too demanding. He remembered agreeing without thinking. That agreement echoed loudly now, ringing with shame. Cruelty feeds on validation, on nods, on silence. Chinita had unknowingly reinforced the very behavior standing in front of him. His absence wasn't neutral. It was an ingredient. Mama Ifioma had endured not because she was weak, but because she was loyal to her son's happiness. That loyalty had been exploited daily, weaponized against her dignity. And Chinita felt a heat rise behind his eyes. Not tears yet, but something close. Outside, a car horn blared and faded into the distance, life continuing without pause. Inside, time felt suspended, stretched thin by realization. Amara shifted again, tapping her fingers against her arm, impatience creeping through her controlled exterior.
She wanted this moment to end, to move on,
to reset the rules. But Chinita wasn't the same man who walked in minutes ago. He could feel the weight of every unseen moment pressing down on him, demanding acknowledgement. He finally understood that cruelty doesn't need fists to destroy someone. It only needs power and opportunity. And both had lived comfortably in his home. The silence thickened once more, but this time it wasn't protective. It was volatile. Mama Ifioma's eyes lifted slowly toward Chinita, carrying years of endurance and one fragile hope. Amara's gaze hardened, calculating what lie might still work. And Chinita stood between them, heart pounding, knowing the truth had crossed a point of no return. The closed doors of this house had hidden too much for too long. Now they were swinging open one by one. And as he drew in a steady breath, a new tension took shape. What would happen the moment he stopped being a silent witness and became an obstacle? The evening was never supposed to happen like this. Chinita remembered the phone call clearly. The meeting canceled, the client apologetic, the sudden pocket of free time opening up like a crack in fate. He had driven home slowly, radio low, mind already shifting into rest mode. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, just a normal return to a house he believed was stable. The irony of it pressed against his chest now. One small change in schedule, one harmless decision, and suddenly, the truth had nowhere left to hide. As he stood there, the weight of coincidence felt heavier than intention. What if he hadn't come home early? What if this night had passed like all the others? The thought clawed at him, because timing hadn't just exposed cruelty, it had saved his mother from something worse. And the question lingered like a shadow. What would tonight have become if fate hadn't interrupted? The house looked ordinary from the outside, lights glowing warmly, curtains drawn just enough to suggest comfort. Neighbors passed without a glance, unaware that something inside was breaking apart. Chinita realized how easy it is for evil to hide behind normalcy. Abuse doesn't need darkness. It thrives in routine. Inside, the smell of food hung faintly in the air, half-cooked, abandoned mid-process, like someone had been interrupted by anger they didn't plan on being witnessed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly now, each second stretching longer than the last. Time had slowed, not out of mercy, but because every moment demanded to be accounted for. And Chinita felt something settle deep in his gut, a certainty that this night had already split his life into before and after. His body reacted before his mind caught up. Muscles tense, jaw locked. A sharp awareness of space and distance filled him. How close he stood to his mother, how far he stood from his wife, how fragile the balance between them felt. The room seemed smaller, tighter, like the walls were leaning in to hear what choice he would make. He noticed the way Amara avoided direct eye contact now, her confidence recalibrating under pressure. She hadn't planned for witnesses. She hadn't planned for consequences. The power she held depended entirely on his absence. And that realization made one thing painfully clear. The cruelty had never been about losing control. It had been about having it. A faint buzz came from Chinita's phone in his pocket. Missed messages from work, reminders of a life that suddenly felt irrelevant. He ignored it. For the first time in a long while, nothing outside this room mattered. The past began lining itself up in his mind. Every late night, Every business trip, every moment he told himself his family was fine. Trust had been convenient. Questioning would have been uncomfortable. And now the bill for that comfort had arrived, overdue and unforgiving. He felt anger rise again, sharper this time, directed not just at Amara but at himself. Coming home early hadn't just revealed the truth, it had exposed his role in allowing it. Mama Ifioma shifted slightly in her chair, wincing as pain rippled through her body, and the sound of it, soft, restrained, cut through Chinita's thoughts like glass. This was the cost of delay, of silence, of assuming love was enough protection. He stepped closer instinctively, placing himself between her and Amara without realizing it. The move was subtle, almost unconscious, but the effect was immediate.
The air changed.
Amara noticed. Her shoulders stiffened, her stance adjusting as if the rules of engagement had suddenly been rewritten. In that moment, Chinidu understood something vital. Presence is power. And his presence had just dismantled hers. The ceiling fan continued its slow rotation, indifferent, while tension tightened below it. Amara's lips parted as if to speak again, to reframe the story, to regain ground. But Chinidu raised a hand slightly, not in anger, but in finality. That gesture alone carried weight. It said enough. It said, I see you. And, perhaps most dangerously, it said, I'm not leaving. The cruelty that survived in secrecy now struggled under exposure. And for the first time, Amara looked uncertain. Not afraid, but unsettled. Control had slipped, and she didn't yet know how to recover it. As night deepened outside, shadows stretched longer across the room, mirroring the ones finally visible inside this family. Chinidu felt the gravity of the moment settle fully into his bones. Coming home early hadn't been luck. It had been intervention. A narrow window through which truth escaped before it was buried again. He looked from his mother to his wife, realizing the night wasn't over. It was just beginning. Whatever came next would demand a decision he could never undo. And as the house held its breath, one question burned brighter than all the rest. Now that the truth was exposed, would he have the courage to face where it led? The moment their eyes met, the house seemed to exhale sharply, like it had been waiting for this collision. Amara's gaze snapped up from Mama Ifioma to Chinidu, and in that instant, time fractured. The confident mask she wore slipped just enough to reveal panic underneath, raw, unpolished, and fast. Her pupils widened, breath catching as reality caught up with her. This wasn't the man she manipulated with soft words and distance. This was a witness, and the hallway between them suddenly felt like a courtroom aisle, narrow and unforgiving, where truth had nowhere to hide. The silence stretched, vibrating with everything unsaid, and Chinidu felt a chill run through him. Not from fear, but from recognition. He wasn't looking at his wife anymore. He was looking at a stranger he had unknowingly invited into his life. A bead of sweat rolled down Amara's temple, catching the light before disappearing into her hairline. She hadn't planned for this angle, this timing, this version of him. Her mind raced visibly now, calculating, rearranging, searching for the right expression to regain control. But the hallway offered no shadows to retreat into. Chinita noticed how her shoulders tightened, how her jaw flexed slightly, how the calm authority she once wielded had begun to unravel. He realized then that lies aren't just spoken, they're worn. And once exposed to the wrong light, they crack. The air between them felt charged, buzzing with the collapse of a carefully built illusion. And Chinidu wondered how many times this same look had crossed her face, only to be hidden again by his absence. The sound of Mama Ifioma's uneven breathing filled the room, grounding the moment in painful reality. Chinita's attention flickered briefly to his mother, then back to Amara, and the contrast hit him hard. One woman shrinking under years of quiet suffering, the other standing tall on borrowed authority. The hallway became a line drawn between them, and Chinita stood directly on it, pulled in opposite directions. Amara opened her mouth slightly, ready to speak, ready to spin, ready to smooth the edges of what had been seen. But Chinita's stillness stopped her. His silence, wasn't passive anymore. It was deliberate. And in that silence, Amara felt something unfamiliar press in uncertainty. Light from the living room caught Amara's eyes again, reflecting something colder now, defiance. If she couldn't hide, she would confront. If control couldn't be quiet, it would be challenged openly. Her posture shifted, chin lifting, as if daring Chinidu to say something first. The hallway felt tighter, walls closing in as tension thickened. Chinidu noticed the change immediately. This wasn't remorse. This was strategy. She was recalibrating, testing how far she could push before consequences landed. And that realization cut deeper than guilt ever could, because it meant everything before now had been intentional. Every smile, every excuse, every delay, all chosen. A distant door slammed somewhere outside, echoing faintly through the night, punctuating the standoff. Chinidu took one slow step forward into the hallway, reducing the space between them. The movement was quiet but powerful, a shift that said he was no longer observing. He was engaging. Amara's eyes flicked briefly past him, toward the front door, toward escape or denial or help. But Chinidu didn't move aside. He held her gaze steadily, unblinking, letting the weight of what he'd seen settle fully between them. This wasn't a confrontation yet. It was a recognition. And recognition is dangerous to someone who survives on secrecy. Amara finally spoke, her voice controlled but edged with strain, trying to anchor herself to normalcy. The words sounded thin, fragile, like glass stretched too far. Chinidu didn't respond immediately. He listened, not just to what she said, but to what she avoided. His mind connected he had ignored for years, and with each connection, the picture grew darker. The woman before him wasn't shocked she'd been seen. She was upset her system had been interrupted. And that truth settled heavily in his chest, reshaping his understanding of love, trust, and marriage in one brutal sweep. The hallway held them in a tense stillness, like a pause before a storm breaks. Mama Ifioma shifted behind him, the faint sound reminding Chinidu why this moment mattered. He felt resolve harden inside him, quiet but firm. Whatever came next would change everything. There was no returning to ignorance now. Amara's eyes searched his face one last time, trying to read which version of him stood there. The husband who looked away, or the son who finally saw. And as Chinidu drew a breath, one irreversible truth pressed forward. The lie had been exposed, but the real battle was only just beginning. The room felt heavier the moment Chinidu realized silence was no longer an option. It pressed down on his shoulders, forcing him to stand straighter, breathe deeper, decide faster. He glanced at his mother first, not because it was easier, but because it was harder. Mama Ifioma sat frozen in her wheelchair, hands folded tightly in her lap, like she was holding herself together by force alone. Her eyes didn't beg. They waited. Waiting had become her strength. Chinidu felt his chest tighten as he understood the weight of that patience. She had been waiting for him for years. Waiting for protection. Waiting for recognition. Waiting for the son she raised to finally see her pain without being told. And standing there, he knew that whatever he chose next would echo through the rest of their lives. His gaze shifted slowly to Amara, and the contrast was impossible to ignore. She stood upright, composed again, arms crossed as if this were a disagreement she could still win. Her confidence wasn't loud, it was practiced, built from years of knowing where she stood in his life.
Wife. Partner.
Priority. Chinidu felt the pull of that history tug at him. Memories rushed in, shared laughter, late-night conversations, dreams spoken in whispers. Choosing against her meant tearing down a future he had carefully built. But choosing her now meant something else entirely. It meant confirming that love was louder than justice. And that was a cost he wasn't sure he could afford. The house seemed to hold its breath as Chinidu stood between them, the physical space mirroring the emotional divide inside him. His heart raced, not with fear, but with the pressure of consequence. There was no middle ground here.
No compromise.
No solution where everyone walked away whole. One path protected comfort. the other protected truth. He realized then that this wasn't just about tonight. It was about who he had been choosing every time he stayed late at work, every time he ignored discomfort, every time he trusted peace over honesty. And the realization burned, because it meant the choice had been happening long before this moment. A sharp ache settled behind his eyes as guilt crept in, slow and heavy. He thought about the sacrifices Mama Ifeoma made, how she turned her pain into silence so he could build a life without burden. He thought about how Amara benefited from that silence, how the house ran smoothly because one woman endured quietly. That balance had always favored him. Now it demanded payment. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of responsibility finally landing where it belonged. Love wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about correction. Amara shifted her weight again, impatience breaking through her calm exterior. She wanted an answer. She needed the moment to tilt back in her favor. Her eyes sharpened, silently challenging him to choose the life he knew over the truth he had just discovered. Chinedu felt anger rise. Not explosive, but controlled, sharpened by clarity. He realized then that neutrality would be a decision too. And neutrality would destroy his mother just as surely as cruelty had. The thoughts settled firmly in his chest, solid and unmovable. Mama Ifeoma swallowed hard, her shoulders lifting slightly as if she were bracing for disappointment she had already prepared for. That single movement shattered something inside Chinedu. It wasn't fear in her eyes. It was acceptance. Acceptance that her suffering might once again be weighed against convenience. And in that moment, something shifted irreversibly. He saw the pattern clearly now. Silence had always cost her everything and spared him discomfort. That pattern ended here, or it would end her. Chinedu drew a slow, steady breath, feeling the house lean into the moment with him. His next move would redraw every boundary in this family. The son he was raised to be, the husband he promised to become, the man he would live as after tonight. Amara's gaze locked onto his, sharp with expectation. Mama Ifeoma looked down, eyes closed briefly, as if surrendering to fate. And as Chinedu took a step forward, heart pounding with certainty, one truth thundered through his mind. Choosing his mother would cost him his marriage, but choosing his marriage would cost him his soul. The tension in the room shifted the moment Chinedu stopped looking at the present and began tracing the past. His eyes drifted to the old corners of the house, the ones that hadn't changed since before Amara arrived. The wooden cabinet Mama Ifeoma insisted on keeping. The locked drawer she never let anyone clean. The habits Amara mocked quietly, but never challenged openly. Hate, Chinedu realized, rarely appears fully formed. It grows slowly, fed by fear and resentment, watered by secrets. And suddenly, his wife's impatience made sense, not as exhaustion, but as something sharper. Something threatened by the very existence of the woman in that wheelchair. Amara's bitterness had always slipped out in fragments. Complaints about how Mama Ifeoma refused to let go of the past. Comments about how the old woman was too involved in matters that didn't concern her. At the time, Chinedu brushed them off as stress. Now, standing in the aftermath of cruelty, those words rearranged themselves into a clearer picture. Mama Ifeoma wasn't just dependent. She was informed. She remembered things. She knew stories about the family's beginnings, things Amara never asked about but clearly feared. And fear, when mixed with ambition, curdles quickly into hatred. A flicker crossed Amara's face as Chinedu's attention lingered on his mother longer than usual. It wasn't jealousy of affection, it was anxiety of exposure. Mama Ifeoma shifted slightly in her chair, hands brushing against the side pocket sewn into the fabric, instinctively guarding something unseen. Chinedu noticed it now, and the movement lodged itself in his thoughts. His wife had never touched that pocket. Never asked what was inside. She avoided it like it might burn her. That avoidance told a story louder than words ever could. And Chinedu felt a knot tighten in his stomach, heavy with unanswered questions. The house seemed to lean inward as memory stacked on memory. Mama Ifioma had once hinted that everything will be settled when the time is right. She said it calmly, without drama, like someone certain of how things would end. Amara had laughed then, too quickly, too loudly, changing the subject immediately. Chinidu had laughed too, unaware of the tension hiding in that moment. Now he saw it clearly. His wife didn't hate weakness. She hated uncertainty. And Mama Ifioma represented the one thing Amara couldn't control: legacy. Amara's cruelty suddenly took on shape and purpose. The impatience, the isolation, the subtle humiliation. These weren't emotional accidents. They were attempts to break authority disguised as caregiving. If Mama Ifioma felt small enough, powerless enough, maybe her words would lose weight. Maybe whatever she knew would die quietly with her dignity. Chinidu felt sick at the thought. His mother hadn't been abused because she was helpless. She had been abused because she wasn't as helpless as Amara wanted her to be. A sharp sound cut through the room as Amara shifted again, her heels scraping the tile like a warning. Her eyes hardened, no longer hiding their resentment. The polite mask cracked just enough for Chinidu to glimpse the truth beneath it. This wasn't about stress. It was about possession. About who truly belonged at the center of his life. And Mama Ifioma, despite her wheelchair, still stood in the way of that claim. The realization chilled him, because it meant the cruelty would never have stopped on its own. Chinidu's gaze returned to his mother, and this time he noticed the calm in her eyes. Not fear, not anger, but certainty. A woman who knew she had already done what was required of her. A woman waiting for the truth to surface in its own time. That calm unnerved Amara more than confrontation ever could. And as Chinidu felt understanding settle heavily into place, one final question rose like a shadow stretching across the room. What exactly did Mama Ifioma know that made her so dangerous to the woman he married? The room shifted the moment Chinidu noticed the box. It sat half-hidden beneath the low wooden bed in the corner of Mama Ifioma's room, its rusted edge catching the light like an unblinking eye. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't modern. It looked old, stubborn, out of place in a house that Amara had carefully redesigned to erase traces of the past. The box carried weight even before it was touched, the kind of weight that comes from years of intention. Chinidu felt it in his chest, a slow tightening, as instinct told him this object mattered. Objects don't survive neglect unless someone protects them. And Mama Ifioma had protected this one fiercely. The question wasn't what was inside. It was why it had survived everything else being stripped away. Mama Ifioma's fingers trembled slightly as her hand moved toward the bed, not in panic, but in decision. She had avoided this moment for years, choosing silence over conflict, endurance over exposure.
But the air had changed.
The lie had cracked wide enough to let truth breathe. The metal box scraped softly against the floor as it emerged fully, its dented surface marked by scratches that looked earned, not careless. Chinidu noticed how Amara stiffened instantly, her body reacting before her face did. Her eyes locked onto the box with unmistakable recognition. Fear flashed, sharp, uncontrolled. And suddenly, Chinidu knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't just paperwork. This was leverage. The lid resisted at first, metal groaning in protest as Mama Ifioma forced it open with deliberate effort. The sound cut through the room like a warning bell. Inside lay neatly folded papers wrapped in cloth that had once been white. The care taken with those documents contrasted painfully with the neglect Mama Ifioma herself had endured. Chinidu's breath slowed as he understood the symbolism, without reading a single word. Everything important had been preserved here, not out of sentimentality, but foresight. Mama Ifioma hadn't been waiting for sympathy. She had been waiting for the right moment. Amara took a step forward instinctively, then stopped herself, fingers curling tight at her sides. Her composure fractured, completely now. The polished wife disappeared, replaced by someone calculating losses in real time. She knew those papers. She had always known. Chinidu saw it clearly in her eyes. The fear of exposure, the anger of delay, the panic of a plan slipping away. Whatever she had been building her future on, it wasn't secure anymore. And the house, once arranged to reflect her control, suddenly felt hostile to her presence. Chinidu reached out and took the documents carefully, as if they might dissolve under careless handling. His eyes scanned names, dates, signatures. Legal language. Official seals. The truth hit him in waves, each heavier than the last. Ownership.
Rights.
Decisions made long before Amara entered his life. His mother hadn't just raised him. She had protected his future with intention and clarity. The cruelty suddenly made horrifying sense. Amara hadn't been trying to escape responsibility. She had been trying to remove an obstacle. Mama Ifeoma watched quietly as her son read, her face calm, resigned, almost relieved. She had carried this burden alone for years, choosing patience over conflict, dignity over confrontation. Her silence hadn't been weakness. It had been strategy. Chinidu felt his throat tighten as guilt pressed in. He had mistaken endurance for helplessness. His mother hadn't been powerless. She had been waiting for the truth to be unavoidable. And now it was. The room fell into a heavy stillness as Chinidu lowered the papers, understanding finally complete. The balance of power had shifted without a word being spoken. Amara stood frozen, eyes darting, breath shallow, watching her future crumble in real time. Mama Ifeoma leaned back in her wheelchair, eyes closing briefly, like someone setting down a weight they'd carried far too long. And as Chinidu looked from the documents to his wife, one reality settled inescapably in his mind. Whatever came next would not be about forgiveness, but about consequences. The room no longer belonged to Amara. That truth settled quietly but firmly, like dust after a storm. The documents rested in Chinidu's hands now, heavy with authority, their presence reshaping the air itself. The confidence that once filled the space had drained out of his wife, leaving behind a brittle tension that cracked with every breath she took. Power hadn't announced itself with noise or violence. It had simply moved, slipped away from the one who abused it, and settled with the one who had endured. Mama Ifeoma sat still, her posture unchanged, but something invisible had lifted from her shoulders. And for the first time, the house felt like it was leaning toward justice. Amara tried to speak again, but her voice lacked its former edge. The authority she relied on had evaporated, stripped bare by truth. She was no longer managing a narrative, she was reacting to one. Chinidu watched her closely, noticing how her words tripped over themselves, how explanations sounded hollow without leverage to support them. Power, he realized, isn't just control over people. It's control over outcomes. And the outcomes were no longer hers to shape. The shift unsettled her deeply, exposing how fragile dominance becomes when it loses its foundation. Mama Ifeoma adjusted slightly in her wheelchair, the small movement drawing attention not because it was dramatic, but because it was confident. Her eyes met Amara's briefly, not with triumph, but with calm acknowledgement. There was no revenge in that look.
No celebration.
Just finality. The kind that comes when a woman knows her suffering has been seen and validated. That quiet dignity hit harder than any raised voice ever could. It reminded Chinidu that real power doesn't need to announce itself. It simply stands its ground. The house seemed different now. The walls no longer echoed with intimidation, but with reckoning. Amara's steps grew smaller, her movements cautious, like someone suddenly aware they were no longer untouchable. Chinidu felt the shift inside himself too. He stood taller, steadier, no longer torn by indecision. Protecting his mother wasn't a choice anymore, it was an obligation overdue. And with that clarity came a strange calm, the kind that follows when chaos finally organizes itself into truth. Outside, the night continued as if nothing had changed, cars passing, distant laughter floating through open windows. Inside, a life structure was collapsing and reforming simultaneously. Chinidu placed the documents carefully on the table, anchoring them in the center of the room like a boundary marker. Amara's eyes followed the movement, her jaw tightening as reality settled in. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't something she could talk her way out of. The rules had changed, and she was no longer writing them. Mama Ifioma exhaled slowly, deeply, as if releasing a breath she had been holding for years. The sound was soft, almost unnoticeable, but it carried weight. Chinidu felt his chest tighten again, not with anger this time, but with resolve. Everything that had been hidden behind politeness and patience was now visible. The suffering, the manipulation, the quiet endurance. And with visibility came responsibility. He understood now that justice didn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrived through paperwork, timing, and the courage to finally look. Amara stood silent, cornered not by walls, but by consequence. The future she had envisioned, secure, unquestioned, controlled, was dissolving in front of her eyes. Mama Ifioma remained composed, unshaken, grounded in the certainty of truth. And Chinita stood between them, no longer divided, but aligned with what mattered. As the room settled into this new order, one final tension lingered, sharp and unresolved. Now that power had changed hands, what would Amara do when she realized there was no way back? The first tear fell without ceremony, landing on the polished tile with a soft, hollow sound. It surprised Amara more than anyone else. Her breath stuttered as if her body had betrayed her before her pride could stop it. Regret arrived not as sorrow, but as panic, loud inside her chest, clawing for escape. She had lost the script, lost the control, and now emotions spilled out where strategy once lived. Chinidu watched quietly, unmoved, because he could see the truth beneath the tears. This wasn't remorse for pain caused. It was fear of consequences finally realized. And fear, unlike guilt, always arrives too late. Amara's voice softened, stretching toward apology, toward explanation, toward anything that might rewind time. Her words tangled together, heavy with desperation, lighter on accountability. She spoke of stress, of misunderstanding, of being overwhelmed. The excuses sounded familiar, echoes of 1,000 moments she had used to justify small cruelties. Chinita listened, not because he believed her, but because he needed to hear how regret tried to disguise itself as innocence. Each sentence fell flat, unable to erase the images burned into his mind. The truth had already rooted itself too deeply to be shaken loose by words alone. Mama Ifioma sat quietly through it all, her face unreadable, her hands resting gently in her lap. She had heard apologies before, not spoken but implied. Promises made through temporary kindness, only to be withdrawn when no one was watching. This time felt no different to her. Regret that appears only after exposure isn't regret. It's reaction. And Mama Ifioma had survived too much to mistake one for the other. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was finality. Chinidu felt a strange emptiness settle where anger once burned. He had imagined this moment differently, louder, harsher, more satisfying. But justice, he realized, doesn't always feel victorious. Sometimes it feels heavy. Watching someone unravel isn't easy, even when they deserve it. Still, he didn't step in to soften the fall. He couldn't. Because every attempt to shield Amara now would be another betrayal of his mother. And that was a line he refused to cross again. The house echoed faintly with Amara's unsteady breathing, each sound amplifying the collapse of the life she built on control. Her shoulders shook now, no longer composed, no longer commanding. She looked smaller, diminished, not because she was being punished, but because her authority had evaporated. Chinita noticed that Mama Ifioma didn't look at her with satisfaction. She looked away. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to endure. Regret circled the room like smoke, thick and suffocating. Amara's tears left dark marks on the tile, quickly wiped away with trembling hands, as if erasing evidence might still work. But some stains sink deeper than surfaces. Chinidu understood then that regret doesn't undo harm, it only highlights it. The damage had already shaped this family in irreversible ways. And no amount of apology could rebuild trust where fear had lived for so long. As the night wore on, Amara's cries quieted, leaving behind a hollow stillness that felt colder than anger ever did. Mama Ifioma adjusted herself gently in her wheelchair, the small movement signaling closure. Chinedu stood rooted, heart steady, mind clear. The moment for forgiveness had passed long before regret arrived. And as the room settled into silence, once more, one final truth hung heavy in the air. Some doors close not out of cruelty, but because staying open would mean inviting the same pain back inside. Morning arrived quietly, slipping through the curtains without asking permission, illuminating a house that no longer pretended to be something it wasn't. Dust particles floated in the pale light, slow and honest, settling where they pleased. The chaos of the night before hadn't vanished. It had simply transformed into clarity. Chinita stood by the window for a long moment, listening to the early sounds of the street waking up, realizing how thin the line was between normal life and moral collapse. Everything looked the same outside, yet nothing inside him was untouched. Truth had a way of rearranging priorities, without warning. And as he turned back toward the living room, one thought pressed heavily into his chest. This was the price of seeing clearly. Mama Ifioma sat near the window now, sunlight warming her face, softening the lines that pain had carved over the years. She looked smaller, yes, but also lighter, like someone who had finally set down a burden she was never meant to carry alone. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, no longer clenched in quiet defense. Chinita watched her closely, noticing how dignity returned slowly, not all at once, after being stripped away. It doesn't rush. It waits for safety. And for the first time in a long while, safety felt possible again. But the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of things that could never be undone. The house itself seemed to reflect the lesson learned too late. Doors once kept shut were now open. Curtains drawn back. Spaces reclaimed. The layout that had once favored control now breathed differently, as if the walls were unlearning fear. Chinidu understood then that environments absorb behavior. Cruelty leaves stains. Kindness requires rebuilding. Respect isn't restored through words, it's rebuilt through consistency. And every small change in the house felt like an admission of guilt and a promise of repair, stitched together in slow, deliberate movements. Chinita's thoughts circled the same truth again and again. Silence is never neutral. Every time he chose comfort over confrontation, he unknowingly voted for injustice. Love without accountability had failed him. Trust without awareness had cost his mother years of dignity. These weren't abstract ideas anymore. They were lived consequences, etched into memory. He understood now that being a good man wasn't about intention. It was about attention, about noticing discomfort before it turns into damage. And that realization cut deeper than anger ever could. Mama Ifioma finally looked at her son, not with blame, but with quiet expectation, the kind that doesn't demand apology, only growth. She had done her part. Raised him, protected him, endured for him. What came next belonged to him. Chinita felt resolve settle into place, steady and unshakable. He couldn't erase the past, but he could refuse to repeat it. Justice, he realized, wasn't just removing harm. It was building something better in its place. The lesson stretched beyond this house, beyond this family. It spoke to every home where silence protects cruelty, where the vulnerable are asked to endure for the sake of peace. Respect is not optional. Kindness is not weakness. And power, when abused, always returns with consequences. The audience wasn't meant to watch this story and feel distant. It was meant to feel familiar. Because stories like this don't begin with villains. They begin with people looking away. As the day settled fully into morning, Chinidu pushed his mother's wheelchair gently toward the doorway, sunlight spilling across the floor ahead of them. The future remained uncertain, heavy with repair and responsibility, but it was honest. And honesty, even when painful, was better than a lie that slowly destroys. The house stood behind them, quieter now, stripped of illusion. And as they moved forward together, one final truth lingered for anyone watching to carry with them. How you treat the powerless will always come back to you, either as shame or as legacy. If you were the one that was humiliated in this video, and God being so kind later saved you from the hands of your enemies, what will be your reaction towards your oppressors? Comment and subscribe on this video. Let us know your mind.